Good evening, everyone. Yari Madat. Welcome to the third in a series of webinars on the National Cancer Series. My name is Leila Dawood, and I will be your moderator today. I'm a co-facilitator with the Vancouver Ismaili Women's Cancer Support Group. Our webinar today will deal with nutrition and cancer. Dr. Laurie McFarlane is unable to join us today. However, in her stead, we have Alison Quinlan, a nutritionist with Inspire Health, who will talk about nutrition and cancer. Inspire Health is a nonprofit supportive care organization in BC. They offer programs and services to enhance the quality of life for people living with cancer. Alison works as a dietitian with Inspire Health, where she weaves together her diverse experiences with kinesiology, geography, and health promotion research to help inform her approach towards the role nutrition plays in supporting health and well-being. The presentation will be approximately 40 minutes, and we have set aside time for questions from the audience. Please send your questions to the chat group. Thank you, and I will now hand the floor over to Alison.
All right, thank you very much, Leila. And thank you everybody for joining in the presentation tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Like Leila mentioned, I am a dietitian at Inspire Health, and I'll be chatting tonight about inspiring healthy choices and nourishing your health with whole food. All right, so I will be talking about general nutrition information today, and I just like to acknowledge before sort of diving in that oftentimes with nutrition, there's so many modifications that might be needed. If we're experiencing difficulties with eating or losing weight and unintentionally, bowel concerns and diarrhea, constipation, obstruction, there's a lot of different things that could go on that sometimes require individual modifications. And therefore, one-to-one meetings help to support to personalize that nutrition and can be really helpful. So whereas I'll be providing general nutrition information today, I'd like to just mention that to always consult a qualified healthcare professional before changing or making any drastic diet changes or medications or supplements or anything like that, to just work for someone so that you can make sure that it is tailored for you. All right, so like Leila mentioned, Inspire Health, I'll just give a little brief intro of who I work for and where I'm from. So it is a not-for-profit charity founded in 1997. So over 20 years now. We are partially funded by the BC Ministry of Health, and then we rely on the generous donations by community members, which allows for us to have no fees for participation, which I just think is truly amazing. It's a very low barrier to have no fees for any of our services. And then we place a huge value in supporting people with cancer and their families to play an active role in their cancer care. And all of our services are rooted in a very evidence-informed lifestyle approach. So Inspire Health started off in Vancouver in that middle circle there, and then expanded to Victoria in 2011, and then to Kelowna. And then a silver lining of COVID has been this amazing expansion virtually. And so we're now offering we've had much greater reach into a lot of more remote communities, as well as across Canada. So it's been really wonderful being able to offer 100% of our services are virtual right now. So that includes any one-to-one meetings, classes, workshops, yoga, all of those things are offered virtually now. And so I imagine as we move forward, we'll probably keep a bit of a hybrid model to support that. So for what I'll sort of be focusing on today, we'll have the following topics to first talk about why is nutrition important? Why do we care about this topic? And go through some of the foundations of a whole food diet and what exactly that means. I'll then chat a little bit about macronutrients and their particular role in our bodies. And we'll talk about what some food sources are of those and why they're important. And then some recommendations for these suggestions for putting everything into practice. But of course, this is always being balanced with what feels right for you and your circumstances. All right, so just a few things to keep in mind or like to sort of highlight. If you think about in a day, we're making a lot of eating and food decisions. Multiple meals and snacks. So constantly having these different decisions for what we're going to eat, and it can be stressful at times. And so really the goal is to help reduce some of that stress around these decisions and recognizing that foods, it's not necessarily a good bad dichotomy, but that foods fall on this whole spectrum, and they play different roles and they support us in different ways. And so looking a little bit at sort of, we like to think of an 80-20 rule or guideline: 80% promote health, 20% for the soul or for those special occasions or for pleasure. And there really can be that wonderful balance. And then, of course, that it's your personal journey with food and your lifestyle, and it's unique to you. And that small steps can make a big difference. And what works for you might not work for somebody else. We have different backgrounds, different cultures, different genetics, different circumstances. So ultimately, tuning into your own body signals and what helps you feel at your best, and what food is going to support that. So we'll chat a little bit about that. So why is nutrition important? Truly the food that we eat is giving our body that energy and those raw materials to work and perform all of these amazing functions that it does. So nutrition is important in sort of these three pillars on the left here in both prevention and reducing the chance or risks for later, lowering those risks in terms of cancer, managing certain side effects, and then also after treatment and preventing or reducing the risk of recurrence. So if we think about some of the different ways that nutrition supports us, there can be a lot of symptoms and side effects, especially with different cancer treatments. And so nutrition can help support some of those, whether that's supporting with our bowels, if we've got diarrhea, or constipation, or gas and cramping, nausea and vomiting. There's lots of different food strategies where nutrition can help support that. Nutrition certainly plays a very important role with our immune system. Lots of different nutrients to support that, helping to nourish the body and feed that microbiome, helping to regulate with the energy and our hormones and our sleep. And especially, if we've got a surgery coming up or certain treatment, helping to support our health to be as best prepared for that as possible. Managing that energy and the protein, which we'll talk about, and those muscle stores. Nutrition also plays a really important role for helping with that recovery and healing. It can help to lower the risk of other chronic diseases as well. And then, generally it can help to improve our quality of life. Protecting, the brain, heart, and body working all together to help overall with that, because the nutrition plays so many different roles for us. So, ideally, what do we want to eat? And as we know, nutrition information can be so complicated these days, and that's why we do want to just sort of simplify things. And first and foremost, supporting our health with whole foods. So foods in its most natural form as possible. We like to encourage, so less processed is the best. So looking for food that hasn't really been changed and modified and packaged. And so we have this little kind of grow, raise, harvest, hunt diagram at the top that sort of relates to that food in that very natural form. And of course, if we make something homemade from these real ingredients, it's very empowering because we get to choose those ingredients and we get to choose how much of them go in there. And you can be a bit creative with that, but very empowering to be able to do that. And also whole foods, they generally taste better, have a higher nutrient density, higher quality foods. So trying to just get them in that whole form. And plants, sort of a plant-based foundation of eating. And just like to add that this doesn't necessarily mean any of these really sort of strict terms such as, or like a vegan way of eating or vegetarian, which absolutely is fine, but just recognizing that plant-based can include lots of different things. It's truly just referring to plants as the foundation within that overall pattern. And then just like to throw in that healthy absolutely can still be tasty. So when we think about choosing whole foods, the American Institute of Cancer Research, which I will just mention, I'll abbreviate to AICR. So they have a very up-to-date, a lot of investing into their nutrition research for cancer support. And so I'll be referencing them a little bit throughout this presentation. But they do talk about that it's no single food or food component that can protect against cancer by itself. It's much more about that variety of the vegetables and fruits and whole grains and beans and those plant foods that helps to lower the risk for many cancers. And really speaking to kind of the synergy of different things in our diet. So that's really referring to sort of vitamins and minerals and how they actually work together and not in isolation. And I'll give an example of that in a second, but just to sort of highlight that most healthful and safe approach is just from that whole food form. And often if we read about something and having a protective benefit, it makes us think that we need to have all of those things, but more is not necessarily always better. It's much more about that variety and that moderation as being really key, and getting those nutrient dense foods that support that variety of those nutrients. So as an example, we'll hear a lot about certain isolated compounds of fruits and vegetables, and of course marketed as supplements. And so we do get lots of questions around supplements, and I think they can serve a purpose at times, but just recognizing that there actually is a lot more benefit found when we are getting those from the whole food rather than that isolated form. An example of this is lycopene. So lycopene is an antioxidant in tomatoes, very well researched, lots of benefits shown with lycopene, in particular being protective with prostate cancer, but it was found that it's actually not as powerful in a supplement form as it is in a whole food form. And then to touch on what I was saying earlier about that synergy of various foods in our diet, that when we eat the lycopene, so the tomatoes, with other foods such as garlic and onions and herbs and olive oil, we actually get a greater benefit from it when it's eaten in combination with these other foods that can act synergistically together. And then adding something like some olive oil or something with that actually increases the absorption or the bioavailability even more of that particular nutrient. So of lycopene, it's absorbed better when it's eaten with a little bit of fat because it's fat soluble. So this is just an example of how we've noticed something that's really beneficial, and then it often gets very isolated, but the most benefits are truly coming when that compound is eaten from that whole food form with other foods in that balance, as having those more greater impacts. So we'll say that research on foods that fight cancer and reducing the risk of reducing the chance of cancer recurrence is certainly ongoing, and it's a very active and dynamic field. So it's a full-time job staying on top of that information. So where can we go? So I happen to be from Vancouver Island, so there's a few Vancouver Island pictures here, but as the weather is starting to get better now, local markets are popping up, and so it's lovely if we are able to get our foods from some of these local places. And of course, regular grocery stores have such a variety now, and many foods from our neighbors in the south. And this does allow us to have rich variety through the year. So, as much as local is wonderful, recognizing the value of where foods are from other places too, and that's okay to support and balance out that diet. I certainly noticed this winter it being quite challenging to get many certain fruits and vegetables that I was looking for. It was slim picking. So using these different places to get some of these foods, and then also being okay that sometimes, and I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but frozen foods, which are often picked at peak ripeness, and which helps them, and then they're flash frozen. So this helps to maintain their nutritional value, and they're a wonderful option in some of the more off-season times of the year to get some of those different sort of fruits and vegetables. So in terms of sort of our food decisions, ultimately we want to try and keep them as simple as possible, and not overcomplicate it, because it can get very overwhelming with so much information. Also important to remember that we are unique. We have different health circumstances, and financial and social and cultural influences. So that goes back to that listening to your body, that 80 sort of 20 moderating approach, or thinking of foods as sometimes foods, or versus more often foods, rather than that good bad dichotomy. So this is just a little spectrum that no intake obviously wouldn't be very optimal in terms of supporting us. And then sometimes there is a time and place for those quick breakfast bars. So yes, they may have higher sugar, higher refined ingredients, but sometimes they serve a purpose too. If we're on a run or very fatigued and things like that. And then the more optimal kind of working along the spectrum is, again, going back to that whole food form that is going to have a lot of that fiber and those vitamins and minerals in there to be supportive. But ultimately, days vary, so making the best choices that we're able to on a particular day with the time and circumstances that we're facing. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit now with the main macronutrients and some of their main roles and food sources and how they can be supportive for us. So the first one that I'll talk about is protein. And protein does indeed serve so many functions, particularly important for maintaining muscle, tissue repair, supporting our immune system, plays a very critical role in that. And therefore very important when we're trying to heal our body, or heal it from surgery or from radiation, or preparing for that upcoming protein to really help support that. And during treatment too, playing a major role. So although protein certainly has more of a role for rebuilding and repair, if we aren't getting any other macronutrients, if we don't have anything else to break down for energy, our body will start to break down that muscle to try and get energy. If that's the state that it's in, where it's just not getting enough nutrients, it will resort to protein as its sort of last resort. But ultimately, protein does play that critical role for just helping with that, maintaining muscle and maintaining, helping with the repair. And so often we'll encourage to have protein consistently throughout the day in sort of small amounts, because our body does only absorb so much at one time. So if we're trying to support somebody with maintaining that lean muscle mass, and preventing any breakdown, really encouraging to have those protein sources consistently throughout the day to just support that process. Protein is broken down into amino acids, and therefore we pull from different food sources to get all these amino acids that we need to perform the different functions in the body. Might have heard of the expression amino acids or the building blocks, and they are indeed, they play so many roles and are truly involved in those building blocks in our body. So just some examples here: beans, meat, poultry, eggs, fish, dairy, legumes, nuts, seeds, and soy are all wonderful sources, whole food sources of protein. So it's great to choose plant protein when we're able to. So this includes things like beans and peas and lentils, nuts and seeds, and to incorporate a variety of these, since many plant-based proteins don't contain that full sort of amino acid that actually a meat protein would, except for soy and tofu. But choosing the variety, and again, it kind of speaks to that synergistic effect. They'll work together. And so that variety is really supportive, especially with plant proteins. But vegetarian sources of protein, they provide that fiber as well, and that starch. So that's going to be supportive for our blood sugars as well. And sometimes, not sometimes, but by soaking and sprouting some of these plant-based proteins, they become a little easier to digest. So if you find that you do get some bloating, or they're challenging for you to digest, certainly really rinsing and soaking a lot of them, and also that sprouting process can be supportive for that and can help with that digestion, and also help to absorb more nutrients from them. They can become a little bit more bioavailable. So certainly something to consider if you're trying to incorporate more of the plant proteins and occasionally struggle a little bit with some bloating and whatnot, to give those two strategies a try. They come in lots of different forms. So lentils, you could get dried, and then you can cook them in water, and they'll firm up. But they also come canned as well, and that can be a really wonderful option. Canned beans and lentils, quite an affordable option, and still rinsing them before using them, but easy to incorporate, ready to go. And then there's frozen as well. That's absolutely an option as well. So they can really support being something that's sort of economical and can help provide some bulk to the meal. So say you were having a chili, adding some beans and lentils into the chili makes the meal go a little bit further, while also adding in that fiber and protein and starch. Or adding some into a pasta sauce is another great option, or throwing on top of salads, or roasting a few chickpeas for a snack I recently discovered is a wonderful snack. So seeking out kind of creative ways, it can sometimes be overwhelming a bit at first if it's not something that we're used to incorporating much of, but starting off slowly and just finding some sort of easy ways to incorporate some of those foods in. Trying something like a Meatless Monday, finding a new sort of plant-based recipe, or just reducing some of the meat and putting in a few of the plant proteins, like a 50-50, can also be a really nice sort of just step in trying to incorporate some more of those foods. So plant protein doesn't include soy, so we gave it a nice little slide on its own. So again, that AICR, or American Institute of Cancer Research, and the WCRF stands for World Cancer Research Fund, do from all of their research show that it is safe to consume in moderation, in that 1 to 2 servings per day, and could possibly even have a protective effect. And this has been shown in both hormone positive cancers and hormone negative cancers. So soybeans do, like I mentioned, contain that full amino acid profile, but the recommendation is around the 1 to 2 servings, and choosing those whole soy food forms. So the tofu or the tempeh, natto or edamame, rather than the really processed, such as the kind of the the processed soy meats, the soy isolates, those soy isolate protein powders, or those sort of some of those really processed veggie burgers. But choosing from those whole soy food forms has shown to be supportive. And epidemiology research, which is research, so looking at different populations and over time in different areas, has shown that populations with a high soy and low animal protein intake are lower risk for both prostate and breast cancer. And whole soy products do have some support around helping with cholesterol and triglycerides, to help with hot flashes and maintaining bone density levels. So lots of wonderful benefits. And again, it's something, if you're hesitant with, you can always chat further with a dietitian and really go through some of that research. But that's really what it's showing, is that that's safe to consume in the moderation, and may even have some of those beneficial impacts. Okay. All right, so animal proteins, again, can also have a wonderful place in a healthy diet. Again, the American Institute of Cancer Research, their recommendation is to limit red meat to about staying under 3 servings per week. So this does include things like beef, lamb, pork, and just reducing it a little bit to that. So again, it can still serve a wonderful purpose for a lot of people, especially in terms of providing protein, iron, lots of other nutrients. And then there's just a few tips around the meat on how to support that. So limiting cooking at really high temperatures. This is where some of those carcinogenic compounds are formed in that charred or sort of burnt meat. So thinking of like when it's an open flame or grilling, that can lead, they're called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Don't worry, there won't be a quiz on that one. But these are just compounds that can occur from the meat when it's cooked at that high temperature, and the charred forms on the meat. And this hasn't been shown in charring on, say, vegetables, but some of the concerns around that with some of those animal proteins. So some of the tips to support cooking with meat are actually marinating it. So marinating the meat for at least 10 minutes with some lemon juice, spices, some olive oil, almost creates like a little bit of an antioxidant layer to the meat. Also using lean cuts, so trimming some of the fat, which reduces those flare-ups. Think of like on a barbecue where it flares up and it chars the meat. So reducing some of that fat on there, using those lean cuts. Raising the rack a little bit further away from that heat source can also be a bit more supportive, and moving the meat frequently, so flipping it and turning it and not just letting it sort of burn to a crisp on one side, and then balancing it, so loading up half that plate with those vegetables, especially the cruciferous ones, to sort of go with it and support it. Also with animal protein, if possible, choosing grass-fed or pasture-raised wild meat. Grass-fed is shown to be a bit higher in omega-3s, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about fats, but these are anti-inflammatory, and so choosing, again, the grass-fed where possible. Fish as well is a wonderful option, and encouraged to consume fish 2 times a week if possible. Again, full of those omega-3 fatty acids. And this would include, I think, of sort of cold water fish like salmon or trout. Sardines are all wonderful examples, and again, high in those omega-3s. And then chicken and eggs and dairy also provide wonderful animal protein sources and have a lot of different nutrients within those. And then thinking of sort of processed meats, this is where some of the recommendations are a little stronger around trying to minimize the processed meats, such as the hot dogs, bologna, deli meats, bacon, sausage, those types of things. Also, the really highly processed tofu, fake sort of soy meats. So minimizing those processed meats. And there's certainly lots of investigation into why does processed meat increase the risk of some cancers because there has been shown to be some correlation and some links, in particular with cancers like colorectal cancer and also other chronic diseases such as heart disease. And there's a few sort of possibilities or hypothesized as to why this might be. One around the nitrates and the nitrites. So these are added to processed meats to preserve or color or prevent spoilage. And some of these can form those cancer-causing compounds or carcinogens. Also, the smoking process of some smoked meats, again, those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, it's quite a mouthful to say, but those that then can form at those really high temperatures are considered carcinogenic, which can happen in that smoking process. And the cooking at high temperatures, like I just mentioned, can create those compounds, and also other ones known as heterocyclic amines, which can cause some damage to DNA. And then there's wondering possibilities about the heme iron found in red meat that may damage a little bit of the lining of the colon, and this is sort of specific to with the research around colorectal cancer. So that was one thing that's being investigated a little bit more. So in terms of options, or what does this sort of mean? Sort of, you know, saving the processed meats for special occasions, or choosing fresh meats most of the time where possible. So replacing some of those deli meats or cold cuts on a sandwich with a fresh piece of chicken or fresh fish. Using, again, the beans or the plant-based proteins in meals like chilies and soups. And aiming, again, like I mentioned, just having some of that protein throughout the day. And also the marinating the meat strategy. So lots of sort of options to work with that and still have things sort of in balance and moderation. Okay, so the next macronutrient I'll talk about is fats. So fats have so many vital roles, and as we know, we've seen fats really get a bad reputation for a number of years, and then they come back around. But fats are so important. They form our cell membranes in our body. They're a primary component of brain cells, almost 60% fat the brain cells made up of. They're a very rich energy source, and certainly one that we rely on. They play a huge role in assisting with the absorption of vitamins. So I mentioned earlier something like lycopene in tomatoes does need that fat to help with that absorption of it. And other fat-soluble vitamins, so like vitamin A, vitamin D, E, K, all of those require fat in order to be absorbed at a high bioavailability. So fat certainly plays a huge role there, and also with our hormones and our satiety. So thinking of, if we're having something like carrots, having a little bit of olive oil in a salad dressing, again, that synergistic of those foods going together to help with that absorption. And this is where sometimes we just have to be careful around certain vegetable juices, and again, making sure there's a little bit of fat with them to be able to absorb all of those wonderful vitamins and nutrients. And then fats make a lot of foods taste better. So if we think of some whole food sources, things like nuts, seeds, avocado, fatty fish, olive oil, lots and lots of options for getting those different fats. Okay. So looking a little bit at the essential fatty acids, and basically what the essential means is that our body needs these. It doesn't produce them, so we need to get them from food. So often the ones talked about are the omega-3s and omega-6. And really with these, the ratio is quite key. And the reason these are talked about so much, and in particular in the cancer nutrition research, is because of their anti-inflammatory or inflammatory properties. So omega-3s are quite anti-inflammatory. When we go into, I won't get into the true nitty-gritty details, but at a biochemical level, they're very supportive in that anti-inflammatory process in our body and helping regulate that. Where omega-6s, which we still need because at times inflammation it does play a very important role. We just want to, of course, reduce that chronic inflammation. But the omega-6s still play a role, but it again is that ratio. So we're aiming for sort of 1 omega-3 to 4 to 6 omega-6. And to not get too tied up in sort of the numbers, but thinking about the sources. So are we getting things like walnuts or cold water fish or flax, hemp seeds, chia? All of those are wonderful sources of omega-3s or precursors to forming the omega-3s. And so just taking a look to see, are those in our diet, or is our diet predominantly made up of grains and meat and some of these oils that are often quite sort of cheap and readily accessible and therefore used in a lot of different foods and processed foods. And that's where that ratio sometimes goes a bit off. And so a typical American diet shows that actually the ratio could be almost 25 omega-6 to 1 omega-3 rather than that sort of 4 to 1. So it can get skewed a little bit. So just looking at, okay, am I getting some of these omega-3 food sources? And if you're ever looking at the content, you will notice that the 6 is always higher. And again, omega-3s are just, they're found in small amounts, and that's okay. So just sort of looking at those food sources to support that ratio and be what's most helpful. And then in terms of sort of refined fats, so these are those trans fats or hydrogenated oils, really deep fried foods, looking at just ways to try and minimize, as these have been shown to be detrimental in just a few different health concerns and areas, whether it's cancer or heart disease or other areas. So trying to just refine some of these foods where possible. Again, trans fats, luckily BC and now Canada has the ban on them. So trans fats certainly aren't as prevalent, but may still be found in things like microwave popcorn or the commercial baked goods. So just sort of looking out for those and watching out for hydrogenated oils or really deep fried foods, just to help minimize some of those refined fats. Okay, and then the third macronutrient we'll talk about is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are a main source of energy for the body, and they're absolutely the preferred fuel source for the brain. So they're broken down by enzymes in the mouth and small intestine and converted to glucose. And so that's like sugar that is quickly absorbed and then converted for energy for our cells, which the cells need that energy to perform all of their functions. So we'll get into that in a little more detail, but just some whole food sources. Fruits are wonderful sources of carbohydrates, vegetables, whole grains, beans, peas, and lentils, all really great sources of whole food carbohydrates. So often with carbohydrates, we really like to emphasize fiber. Fiber plays a number of wonderful roles and certainly has strong research to be supportive with cancer, and in particular, fiber plays a very important role with breast cancer and helping with estrogen. So choosing foods that are high in fiber often refers to those whole grain type products. So whole grains have the bran. So the bran is what contains that fiber. In that. And so again, the fiber is helpful for colon health and for bowel movements, our satiety and keeping us full, a very important role in blood sugar regulation, cholesterol, and then like I mentioned, hormone management. And it also, the fiber feeds that good bacteria in the gut, so helps to reduce inflammation, plays a role in our immune system with these short chain fatty acids that help to ferment and form. So plays a really important role, that outer bran layer that contains that fiber. And then the next layer there is the endosperm. And this is what contains the starch. And again, starch or sugar provides that energy component, which also is very important. And then we've got the germ down in the middle, which contains many of the vitamins and minerals and oils, which also is important. But often what we see in refined grains is that that outer layer is taken away. So then we're only left with the starch and the germ. And so if we're thinking of refined carbohydrates, these are things like white bread, white rice, white pasta, things that have had that outer bran removed, and now they're going to impact our blood sugars a lot more. They'll cause a faster rise in our blood sugars because fiber helps to really slow that, because as our body's breaking this down, you can imagine it has to work a lot harder when it's working through that bran and fiber. So fiber playing a big role in those blood sugars. And then if we don't get that bran and that fiber, our gut bacteria is missing out on that component as well. So trying to choose that whole grain when possible. There we go, there's the fiber slide. So fiber is a type of carbohydrate that the body can't digest, and that's why it plays such an important role with our bowel movements and with hormones, and like I said, with estrogen and helping with that. So the general recommendation, 25 to 38 grams a day for fiber to help with preventing chronic disease. And from these, so the whole grains we talked about, and the legumes, vegetables, and fruit. And if you're someone who's trying to, increase your fiber, just being cautious to make sure that it, slowly increase it and stay really hydrated. So be sure to be drinking lots of water to support with that. And small changes can make a big difference. It doesn't have to be these huge drastic changes. Something as small as switching from the white toast in the morning to a whole wheat and then to maybe a whole grain can make a really, really big difference. And then I just will acknowledge that some cancers and symptoms do require a low fiber diet. And I know it can be really counterintuitive for a lot of people when we sometimes recommend that because, we hear we've got to eat fiber and it's so important, but just know that sometimes there are times where we may require lower fiber. Often it's temporary to help manage certain symptoms such as a bowel obstruction or chronic diarrhea, something like that. But that's often where a doctor or a dietitian will work with you to help manage that, to manage your particular symptoms. All right, so I mentioned choosing whole grains, but I wanted to highlight that sometimes the sprouting breads can be easier to digest. So looking for a sprouted bread, and a general rule of thumb I like to suggest is just looking for one that's got 4 grams or more of fiber per serving. That's usually a good indication that the bran's intact, the fiber's still there, and can it just be supportive with being full of that fiber and hasn't had that bran stripped down. And then there's so many varieties. So consider variety in grains. I've got this little picture here just to show that there are lots of different whole grain options. It doesn't have to simply be our particular bread. There could be a type of pasta that we choose that's a whole grain, or the whole oats, or trying a new one such as farro, which I recently tried and it was lovely. So lots of wonderful options, and again, variety is key. And then, of course, the wonderful fruits and vegetables, which again are great carbohydrate sources, full of vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals. And again, with that variety, often encourage thinking of eating the rainbow. You'll see here we've got, the red, the bright red peppers, or strawberries, or tomatoes. Orange can be full of, oranges and orange peppers, and lots of different options in there. And then, the beautiful blues and purples with the berries and the eggplant. So all of these have their own benefits. And so choosing variety where possible and just incorporating different ones can be really helpful. The American Institute of Cancer Research recommends at least 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables, but more is better if tolerated, even 7 to 10. We were just doing a review on fruits and vegetables and cancer research, and again, showing a lot of positive protective trends with them, especially in particular with ovarian cancer. So yeah, incorporating those fruits and vegetables and that variety. And recognizing that, again, it can be tough to get fresh, especially in the winter time, and that frozen is absolutely a wonderful option. They are, they're cut, they're at peak ripeness, and then freeze frozen and really retain a lot of nutritional value. So absolutely an option in the winter time. And then we get a lot of questions around, well, how to sort of cook them, and are there differences? And they all have benefits, whether it's raw, cooked, and fermented. There's sometimes different benefits, and even the same vegetable could provide some benefits raw, and then even additional ones once cooked. So again, that variety and mixing up how you prepare those vegetables can play a big role. Sometimes the raw versions have some more vitamin and enzyme benefits, but cooked sometimes is easier to digest and we absorb a little bit more. So just playing around with those different processes of how you prepare the fruits and vegetables. Another example is sort of raw spinach. Great vegetable to include, can be high in oxalic acid, which can impact some nutrient absorption, and then when we cook it, that oxalic acid decreases, and so it doesn't impact other nutrients. So there's just to recognize the importance of preparing things differently with some of that different variety. And then fermentation can help to increase the bioavailability. So certain fermentation or soaking things can just help with that and reducing some of the phytates and lectins. And then just like to think about, again, can we get it in that whole form? And then if something, so an apple, for example, would be the whole form. It could be blended in a smoothie, still getting a lot of those wonderful nutrients. But then sometimes when we juice things, we actually lose a lot of that fiber. So just recognizing that there are some differences, and if it's juiced and already broken down, our body's no longer doing that process. And so that can cause that increase in blood sugars, whereas a whole one won't raise that quite as quickly. And then in terms of sweeteners, it's always lots of controversy over these, but trying to choose natural over refined, they'll still have an impact on our blood sugars, but when we choose sweeter from food, like dates, bananas, sweet potatoes, applesauce, we're getting some of that fiber, we're getting some of that nutritional value, rather than something that's really refined into quite a white sugar or a syrup of some sort. So these at least will give us some of the other nutrients. And same with even honey and maple syrup, which again will cause that rise in blood sugars, but at least there's some trace minerals and nutrients in some of those products. And as we choose our sweeteners from food, it can help decrease that reliance on that really processed sugar. We can start to sort of change those taste buds. So just recognizing the importance with that, and then watching out for some of those hidden sugar sources, which easily creep into things like ketchup or salad dressing. So just taking a look or making your own so that you can control that. Goal may be to choose naturally sweet foods when possible because of that retraining of the taste buds. But also we can combine some of those small sweet foods with some protein and healthy fats, and that will help with those blood sugars. I like to say that there can always be an opportunity to, have some chocolate, have some of those sweets, but then pair it with a little bit of protein and a little bit of fat, and that's going to help with those blood sugars that I'll talk about shortly. So just to reiterate that natural foods with sort of those natural sugars will contain those vitamins and minerals and fiber and a little more nutrients than some of those added sugars that get it put into foods and then are replacing some of those less sort of or not as nutrient dense options. So in terms of artificial sweeteners, the research is pretty inconclusive. around it. Health Canada, of course, approves and does look into these to be safe, but they're very mixed findings on a lot of them. We just basically encourage, if we can get it from a true food source. Again, this depends on circumstances and the particular person and the role that these may be playing. But the artificial sweeteners can impact our microbiome. They can impact our taste buds a little bit and cause us to have more cravings for more sweet things. So I think it's just always good to have a sort of conversation about what purpose they might be playing, and then understanding some of those things that can happen with them. So I've been mentioning a lot about with blood sugars, and just wanted to sort of show this, that really to support our bodies and health and with making sure we're kind of in an anti-inflammatory rather than promoting inflammation, to balance our blood sugars. And so over on the left is where if we were waking up in the morning, we have sort of low blood sugars. We haven't eaten anything overnight. And then we might have, if we have something, a balanced meal, no matter what we have, they'll go up a little bit and then back down. And we just try and keep that balance and moderated throughout the day, rather than dropping and plummeting and then all of a sudden having a huge spike in some of those sugars or carbohydrates. So I'll show a better example in a second of what that would look like. But if our blood sugars are a bit imbalanced, this can lead to things like irritability, anxiety, poor concentration, cravings, and this could be caused both on those sugar highs and those sugar crashes. So just being aware of some of those sort of signs of that our blood sugars might be a little bit imbalanced there, and can impact, that wound healing as well. So here's the picture I was thinking of. So as you can see here, carbohydrates will cause that biggest rise in the blood sugar levels. Proteins a little more moderated, and that gray line for fats could even be a little bit lower than that. It has a very, very small impact on our blood sugars. But truly those carbohydrates are fastest to break down, and that's why I mentioned that pairing. So if we add some protein and fat, it helps to moderate that green line, and it'll balance out our blood sugars, helps reduce that spike in those blood sugars, and then this is sort of supportive for health long run with a variety of different chronic diseases and things. And then just to touch on the importance, of course, of hydration. There we go. So 60% of the body is made up of water, hydration being so important, supporting with our brain and our digestion, kidneys and heart health. And there can be lots of different options for getting in some of that water and liquid. It doesn't just have to be water, but herbal tea, broth, soup, fruit and vegetables, smoothies, ice chips, all of these things will support our hydration. And this on the right here is just a urine test that can kind of check in to see how your hydration is. If it's starting to get pretty dark in color, might indicate being a little bit dehydrated. Also recognizing certain foods can change the color, beets, vitamin B12, so with those sort of in mind, but generally speaking, this can be helpful for seeing how our hydration levels are. And then just recognizing that alcohol and cancer is something we do get asked a lot about. There isn't exactly a safe level that's been determined. A general recommendation from the American Cancer Society talks about 1 drink per day for women or 2 for men. But again, it's there's no recommendation for cancer prevention. It encourages to not sort of drink alcohol. And that it can also be a diuretic, and there is some correlation with ethanol increasing that circulating estrogen as a risk for breast cancer. So how do we put everything together? So this was Canada's new food guide that came, well, I guess not too new, came out a few years ago, but encouraging the plant foods because, again, of that fiber we talked about and the protein, the healthy fats, but truly just trying to balance our plates. Can we balance it with more fruits and vegetables? We've got those whole grain sources of fiber, and then a variety of different of protein sources from a variety of sources, and drinking water when able. Again, Canada's Food Guide went the route of sort of plant-based, but again, that's not labeling something as having to be vegan or vegetarian. It's just as having it as a bit of that foundation or based on those plant foods. So for putting everything together, you know, and we'll again have those different circumstances, and fatigue comes at different times, but planning ahead, helping or leaning on those support people to help with some of that planning or grocery shopping when we need that support, or making big batches ahead and freezing. A little bit of planning can certainly go a long ways, and it's so much more helpful when we have some of those things on hand. And so eating and drinking with intention, and helping make those your home sort of your food oasis with the foods that are supportive for you and that help make it easier for you to choose the foods that you want to and that are nourishing for you. So helping to sort of, love this little excitement on the boy's face, but just discovering that there can be a lot of joy in trying out some of these different foods and incorporating them in, and really going for that variety or trying out different recipes, using those all together, that there can be a lot of joy in sort of nourishing ourselves and feeling that way, while also recognizing there'll be challenging times too, and that's okay as well. That will happen. So just in summary, really talked a lot about variety and moderation, working towards balance, drinking enough water throughout the day, and choosing those whole foods, limiting those processed foods. We talked a lot about the importance of the fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, trying to go for some of those more natural food sources of sugar rather than the really refined and processed. Some of those aiming for, keeping sort of our max 3 servings of red meat, and looking at those other protein options of plant-based proteins and fish, poultry, eggs, things like that. And then just generally with the avoiding the alcohol where possible, or just having in moderation amount. And so Inspire Health does just offer nutrition services. If you're ever interested in more, we have 75-minute initial nutrition and lots of time for follow-ups. And we also have themed cooking classes. I'm doing one next week on how to incorporate beans and lentils. Lots of nutrition talks and recipes. So lots of resources available for anyone who might be interested. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and happy to go into any questions.
Thank you, Alison. Wow, that's a lot of information to absorb. We do have a few quick questions. One of them, what are your thoughts about GMOs and pesticides? People ask to eat organic food, etc.
Yeah,
the GMOs and pesticides. It might be a big question, loaded, but
it's a wonderful question. Again, it's not a simple answer. GMOs has rooted from things just like crossbreeding, kind of natural farming practices, and has evolved into this. So I imagine the question's coming from thinking with companies like Monsanto and this sort of how that's shifted a little bit. So I think there's a few things to consider. I think in terms of, well, maybe I'll speak to sort of organic first and then touch back to the GMO. But with organic and non-organic foods, I think we really have to weigh out a few different things, such as cost. Is it feasible for us to afford everything organic? I mean, yes, I think that might be lovely. I still think it's important to clean our fruits and vegetables, of course. But recognizing that ultimately the benefits that we can get from fruits and vegetables do, like, I guess that what I'm saying is they do far outweigh, if it's non-organic, at least we're still getting those wonderful nutrients and still having it. So that'd be better than not having them at all. I think choosing organic can be absolutely nice thing to do. Just recognizing again that the cost can be a little more challenging, and sometimes they don't keep as long. So just there are some factors there to consider with it. I also I have been trying to do more reading into how there may be some foods that are better to choose organic than others, and there are some lists and research with that on the internet. That yeah, so if we're going to choose them, we could at least choose the ones that are sort of really recommended to pick, that are pick these particular ones that are organic, because maybe those are ones that typically absorb more pesticides and things like that. So a few different considerations there, not a straightforward answer. Ultimately, we just still want to have lots of fruits and vegetables and wash them, all of them, organic or not, where possible. But that's weighing out some of those things as to which one to pick. And then in terms of GMO, yeah, it's a very complicated topic. And there's just such a huge spectrum of what GMO seems to be referring to these days. And I think if we can support like local farming practices at farms that we sort of know they're farming, rather than those really sort of large scale ones that may be heavily rooted in some of like Monsanto seeds and things like that, it just gets very complicated with the varying degrees. So I think some foods, it's necessary for that genetic modification to produce the food that's even going to be able to sustain populations and feed people. So I think there's also that place too. I think, again, it sort of comes down a little bit to personal preference too, and can we afford, because buy the organic ones that may not have the GMO or the pesticides, and that's often where some people land if they're able to afford that. But yeah, it's a bit of a complicated question that I likely wouldn't be able to do justice for in a few minutes. Good question.
Thank you. This one might be more interesting. What are some food ideas for seniors who can't chew or people with no teeth?
Okay. Yeah. So really seeking out those, soft foods. And I did work in a long-term care home a few years ago, and so that was something looked at a lot. So I mean, just a few ideas off the top of my head when we think of things like applesauce and sweet potatoes, and just in some of those, I think we can still have wonderful foods, but maybe the cooking process needs to mash them down a little bit. And it was I think the question was for no teeth or pain when chewing. Is it both of those things? Okay, well, I'll answer it for both. So yeah, so just making those foods a lot more softer. Sometimes even without teeth, we can still eat lots of foods, but obviously the tough meats or hard apples are challenging. So that's where some of that cooking and modifying the foods in that way can be supportive for making sure we can still get those things like oatmeal, rice, quinoa. A lot of those foods are still usually quite manageable without teeth, or needing a really kind of soft foods. I think of sort of also soft pastas, with some sauce, and adding sauces to things to help with that. Lots of great options. Smoothie drinks, I think, can be a helpful option for blending up some of those foods that might be harder to chew typically. So those are the ones that come to mind. And sometimes I've even seen people like blend up. If the chicken's too hard, if there's some meat like that, blending it up a little bit, making it a bit pureed, modifying it yourself that way, can also help. And I mean, it still tastes the same, and you can blend it with a little bit of broth as well. And that's also an option. So I hope that gives a few ideas.
Yeah, that definitely helps, I'm sure. We don't have much more time, but I should say one more question, that maybe a couple more questions. Please highlight how to increase hemoglobin and iron on a veggie diet.
Okay, so this is a great question. I mean, this is something I'd work very individually with somebody with. If the ferritin level was very, very low, and on a vegan diet, often we do need to recommend a supplement. I just always get hesitant in sort of a presentation to going about supplements, because it really just depends on that particular person. So I would suggest speaking with a dietitian or doctor, and if you're on a vegan diet and have low hemoglobin, low iron, low ferritin there, often a supplement is needed to help support that and to bring that up. If your sort of baseline on a vegan diet, sometimes a supplement can still be helpful with the iron, but then also choosing beans and lentils, cooking with a cast iron pan can actually help with a bit of iron, molasses, some iron. There's also, I'm forgetting the name, I think they're called like a something fish that you can put into your pan when you're cooking, and iron fish. And that can actually help with iron to the food. So there's certainly a few options there, but yeah, a lot depends on kind of where those levels are at. But the food options first would be the beans and lentils, cooking with the cast iron pan, the iron fish, and then depending on where your levels are at, looking at if a supplement is needed.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, are bananas, grapes, and sweet potatoes too high in sugar? Should they be limited in a diet? Things like dates, jaggery. I'm trying to sort of put it all together so that we have.
So it was bananas, dates, and grapes.
Potatoes.
Sweet potatoes. Yeah, so honestly, these are all wonderful, wonderful foods. They've got fiber in them, they've got nutrients in them. So where I would encourage is balancing that with some protein and some fat. So if you were going to say have a banana on its own, balance it with some peanut butter. If you were going to have some grapes, balance it with a few almonds. And in that way, because you're right, there's sugar in those, and that's totally okay. There's still so many wonderful nutrients that you're going to be getting, and the fiber in there. So just if you pair it with something, it'll make a really nice balanced option. Just a quick little tip too about potatoes and sort of sweet potatoes. If you let them cool slightly, that starch will reform a little bit, and it actually slows down that rise in blood sugars. So that can also be supportive for just helping with that. But again, if you've got it paired with some salmon or some tofu, and it's a part of a balanced meal, no, I wouldn't have concerns around that as a balanced meal. And then you also dates was in there, so same thing. I would pair the dates with some peanut butter or some protein and fat just to go with that, rather than sort of having them on their own.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe time for just one last question. In our traditional cooking, we use a lot of hot chilies.
Hot chili.
Chilies. Is there any ideas about what chilies, whether they're a good or bad idea to have in your meals?
Oh, good test for me on my last question. So certainly in terms of some spicy foods like that, they're shown to be anti-inflammatory and be healthful. There isn't anything that particularly comes to mind that I'd be watching out for. I mean, I'd still think about, because it's from a natural food source, it wasn't like you were modifying something through a different process to do that. So no, I think that's fine to include, and I think it can add so much wonderful flavor. Any sort of spices and flavoring are often quite helpful for foods. I think moderation is always important for sure, but if it's something that you've had incorporated in there, part of a kind of balanced diet with the other foods, there's nothing that sort of stands out to me that to be worried about with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Alison, for a very informative and thought-provoking session. Thank you also to our audience for your questions and the feedback back. Our next webinar on the emotional impact of cancer is scheduled for April 20th. Thank you once again, Alison. Thank you, everyone, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Leila.